Hey guys, I'm Luke Huckaba. I'm an architect at Rackspace. I'm also a V expert. I'm here to talk to you real quick. This is a very high-level, fast-paced SRM. We call it distilled SRM because we're trying to get as much out of it as we can in this short period of time. So I got to do the requisite legal slide here. You read that, right? We're good. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about real quick today is just three kind of main talking points. What are the basics of SRM? What are we going to cover? How does it actually work? I'll cover some planning things you need to think about when you're actually putting together an SRM solution. And then I'm going to go over some SRM configuration items, mappings, lots of mappings. There's resource mappings, network mappings, folder mappings. We'll talk about those. And then protection groups and recovery plans. And hopefully I won't go too long for you guys, and we'll get through this. So first, let's talk about the basics. What are the basics in SRM? There's a test, there's a cleanup, there's a recovery, and a reprotect. In that test, VMware says it's a non-disruptive test. But what does that actually mean? They say non-disruptive because it spins up in a bubble network, test network. It doesn't interfere with anything else. The problem is when you're spinning that up at your target side, you're increasing your I/O on your target side frame or whatever it is. The IOPS are increasing, so that could potentially impact any production systems on that target side. The also problem is if you run the test on the bubble networks, you can only test on VMs within that same host, and you can't test your actual application outside of that. So if you were to run a test on a live network and really get live communication, you could have IP conflicts. You could talk to a production database server, possibly poisoning your database. You could poison AD in the fact that your test Windows server just happens to change its Windows machine password at that time. So those are just things to think about when you're testing. They say it's non-disruptive, but be careful because it can be very disruptive. Now, when you run that test, it spins up all your VMs kind of in a snapshot, and they just kind of run on the storage and they do their thing. If you have to reconfigure any configuration files or connection strings for your database, document that. Export any files, copy them out, do what you need to do, because once you hit that cleanup button, it completely destroys that snapshot. There's no recovering that snapshot once it's gone. What you would have to do is rerun your test and then come back in and replicate all those changes and document them. So yeah, when you hit that cleanup, there's non-reversible. It deletes that storage snapshot and just moves on. So when you run a recovery, there's two forms of recovery that you can run. The first one is a planned migration, and it's just like what it sounds like. When you hit that recover button, it actually goes through and it talks to your storage. It says, all right, let's go ahead and replicate. Once that replication's up to date, it shuts down your VMs and then replicates again. So everything is one-to-one. It's pretty much making everything app consistent, making sure everything is clean OS, shut down, everything is good to go. Then it sets the storage as writable at the target site and read-only at the source site, so that when you spin everything up, you can't change anything at your original source site. It's effectively a forklift migration of an entire cabinet from one data center to another data center. It works pretty well. Now, the recovery in a disaster mode tries to do the exact same thing. But instead, when you hit that little "this is disaster mode" radio button, if there are any errors, it just continues. It kind of expects errors. It assumes that something is going to fail and says, okay, if this does fail, I'm just going to keep going. And I'm going to go ahead and try to power up these VMs and keep going as far as it can. Once it's done, your VMs will be running, but if you look, that recovery plan will be in an inconsistent state, and you have to go in, or incomplete state, you have to go in and rerun it once your source site is up and running so that it finished 100% and everything is completed. Now, VMware points out that they have the failback button. They say, yes, we now have failback. The problem is if you look for a failback button, it doesn't exist. There is no real failback button. Once your recovery makes it to 100% successful, you have to run a reprotect. That reprotect, what it actually does is it talks to your storage and it reverses replication to go back the other direction. It makes sure that everything is lined and ready to get shipped back to your original source site. But if you had any IP customization set up in SRM, it actually flip-flops all of that stuff too. It flip-flops which is your protected site, which is your recovery site, and it effectively reverses your entire recovery plan. So if you had any hosts that it put into sleep mode or something, this will now bring them back out of sleep mode. So it's really useful in that if you had a bunch of custom tasks, it flip-flops all of that to go back the other way, and works pretty well. So one of the things to think about when you're doing your vCenter installation, you could either do the simple install or the custom install. The simple install works fine for most people. It's just install SRM on your Windows machine and go about your business. vCenter appliance or not, I like the vCenter server appliance, but the problem is SRM still requires a Windows server. So even if you do the vCenter server appliance, you have to deploy a Windows server to install SRM on it. So if you did that, say if you did have the Windows installation and you had the simple install for SRM, a simple install for vCenter, you can then put your SRM installation on top of that. SRM does not require a lot of resources. It's like 1 gig of RAM. I think you could build a VM with 1 CPU, 1 gig of RAM, and like 60 gigs disk space, and it would handle all of SRM. So you can tack it on top of vCenter and be fine. You don't really have to worry about that. So now let's talk about some planning things here. This is one of the big things to think about. When you're planning, think about your storage. What are you going to do for your storage? How are you going to replicate? vCenter replication comes with the VMware licensing, and it works well. You can do RPOs as far back or as little as 15 minutes, and of course you saw maybe as little as 5 minutes on newer versions. But it has its limitations. And up to 5.8, you can only do 500 VMs in there. And 6.0, you can do 1,000. But there's still some other limitations. One major thing I've noticed, I've discovered through talking with some other people in the community, whenever you protect a VM within vCenter replication, it goes through and it does a checksum 1 meg block at a time, and it's not throttled. And so if you threw a bunch of VMs at it at one time, it can completely saturate your network to, like say if you had a NetApp or IP storage, it can completely saturate those network links doing the checksums on those 1 meg blocks. So that's one thing to think about. Now, if you're using like a large array, like say EMC or the NetApp like I was talking about, you want to talk with the storage vendor and figure out how their replication actually works. So if you think about Recover Point, it requires a journal run, and EMC recommends 20% of your replicated data for that journal run, the size. And most times it'll work okay, but that 20% in testing I could fill up in like 8 hours. So if you're running an SRM test for an extended amount of time, you want to make sure you size that journal run properly. They need to really explain to you how it works. It actually breaks it up into 2 spots, and you can only use a percentage of that journal run and test, and only another percentage is used for replication traffic coming in. So really get a deep dive into the storage to figure out how it does replication and how it behaves when you're running a test. And if they don't really know, ask for the next person that does, and really get as much information on that as you can. So this is just a little diagram of how vCenter replication works. If you kind of look, you can see there's a vCenter replication appliance that lives on the ESXi host. It monitors all changes going to a VMDK on that 1 meg block. That's why it checksums at 1 meg blocks. And it sends those across to a vCenter replication server, and that vCenter replication server at your target site actually writes those change blocks down to the VMDK on whatever data store you said to put it on. That's where I was saying that can impact performance on other VMs. There's an agent running on that host, and if you're processing a bunch of checksums, your CPU can go high. The connectivity back to your storage can be saturated. Just be mindful of that when you're running through it. Now, array-based replication works 1 layer down. So all that replication happens down at the LUN layer, or at your frame layer, or your filer layer, however it's set up, however they handle it. And so there's no impact to your ESXi host. They're completely ignorant to the fact that some replication is going on. They have no idea, and there's no impact on it. One thing that they added in 5.8 was the IP customizations, and it's really slick. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it rather than sitting here. That's kind of what it looks like, but I've got a video here that you can see, and I don't know how well it's going to come out for you guys, but let's check it out and see. So when you're in your network mappings there, yeah, let's see. Oh, I didn't like that. Okay, anyway, so I'll go back one more here, maybe. Yeah, I suck at this. There we go. All right, so when you go into your network mappings, you actually see that network mapping in your 2 networks that are linked between your source and target side. You can add this IP customizations right here, so the entire subnet can change. The first 3 octets, the first 2 octets, or whatever, however you have it set up, whatever your subnet is, you can configure this network mapping change so that it changes the IP across the board. When you actually go in and fail over, it will monitor. It will look and see, all right, am I connected to this network adapter that's part of this IP customization mapping? And if it is, then it says, okay, which adapters or what IPs do I have in here and what needs to be changed? And it will go through and change them. Now with 5.8 on these resource mappings, the network mappings, there's a checkbox for you to actually say, create a reverse mapping. It doesn't work for the IP customizations. You have to go to your target side and set up another IP customization coming back the other direction. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You might have checked all the boxes to create a reverse mapping, but this IP customizations won't exist over there. So you can set all kinds of stuff. You set your range, you could set DNS, you could set your gateway, you could set DNS search suffix, you could even set WINS servers. I actually found a guy today that still uses WINS, that one guy. So some of the limitations, like I was talking about, 5.8, you can have 500 VMs. 6.0, though, they added 1,000 VMs. There's still a limitation on how many VMs per the vCsphere replication server, which, take a look there. I'm not going to cover it too long because I don't want to run too long on this presentation. Some of the installation speed bumps I had was that when I was installing SRM and I changed the directory where it was installed, and I changed the C to a D, it didn't like the space and program files. The installation actually failed and gave me an error saying it cannot find D program because it couldn't handle the space. So keep that in mind when you're installing SRM. If you're going to do a custom destination location, make sure it's a name without spaces. Also, they recommend that you install vCsphere replication prior to installing SRM. As of SRM 5.8, they no longer bundle vCsphere replication into it. With 5.5 and previous, when you installed SRM, it would ask you, do you want to install vCsphere replication? That's no longer there. I've done SRM and then installed vCsphere replication, and it's not a problem. It works, but their recommendation is to install vCsphere replication first. And then lastly, they fixed a lot of the password stuff I pointed out in 5.5 in my session here at VMworld last year. But the quotes, you still cannot have quotes in the database password, but it at least catches it and it'll warn you, like, hey, there's quotes in here, you can't have it. So now let's talk about some architecture and configuration things. So yo dog, I heard you like mappings. So one of the things, when you set up your network mappings, it's a one-to-one mapping from source to target. And you want to set the same thing coming back the other direction on all network, folder, and resource mappings. The last thing you want is to fail 5 different networks over to one network and then force that one network to fail back into one network and then have to go back in and clean all that up. It's really kind of a pain, so it's best to do a one-to-one mapping. If you can't do that on your resource, like your cluster level, set up resource pools so you have a one-to-one mapping on clusters to resource pools at your target side. And then placeholder data store, it only has to be, you could get away with 1.3 gigs because that's the actual minimum that you can put in vSphere data store size. 5 gigs works, you're never going to fill that up. You could have thousands of VMs and you're still not going to fill that up. So I'm just going to let this video play, and I'm about out of time, and see if I can actually get it to work here. Yeah, so here's how you go through and you add your network mappings. You can just expand that. You select which network you want. And then once you select it, you can add it to the other side. Once you add it, you'll notice, wait for it, add. There's a checkbox there on the right side that says create reverse mapping. That's what I was talking about earlier. Make sure you select all those so that everything is set up properly. And then you do the same thing for resource mappings, which is just cluster level, and then network mappings if you actually had them, folder mappings if you had your folders set up in different sections for different use cases, like your development folder or production, certification, UAT, whatever you wanted in there. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to the end of this one. So a VM can only be a member of one protection group, but you can have multiple protection groups and multiple recovery plans. So you can kind of nest all that stuff. One thing to keep in mind, the boot priority is an attribute of the VM itself and follows that VM across all protection groups and all recovery plans. If you change it on one test plan that you have, it changes it on your production plan too. So keep that in mind. If you want to know any more, just hit me up on Twitter. It's at TepHuck. That's ThePhuck, and come by the Rackspace booth, and I'll see if we can do anything for y'all. So thank you, everybody. Y'all have a good one.